Well, Jonathan Haidt is the gift that just keeps on giving when it comes to exposing the lunacy of social justice. In a podcast with Sam Harris earlier this year, he relates his run-in with a particularly troubled social justice snowflake.
So what the hell is going on politically? And you've pointed this out in many different ways in the past. There's a level of, there are different blind spots on the left and right politically and morally. And the conversation between the two, or lack thereof, plays out in really bewildering ways at this point. So give me your thinking at the moment on this topic.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I've been extremely alarmed by the way campus culture at a lot of our top schools has changed radically just in the last 2 years. There are these new ideas about safety, and I hear undergraduates often saying things like they just take it for granted that a classroom is supposed to be a safe space. Now, if they mean that the teacher shouldn't insult people or people shouldn't, hit each other, of course. But what they mean is that people should not be exposed to ideas that might make them feel marginalized or demeaned. For example, if somebody were to question affirmative action, that could be threatening to students who might have benefited from affirmative action. Therefore, you can't question it. And it's very strange that people are getting in trouble. And I was dragged before the Equal Opportunity Commission for showing a video that in class that one student objected to one word that a student said in it. All this
really? What was the word?
Disgusting. So it was in the context of a discussion about the dumbfounding scenario, actually. And it was a conversation between two UVA undergraduates, and one of them he's cross-examining the other one. The experimenter cross-examines the other one, and the guy ultimately says, well, I don't know, I can't explain why it's wrong. Well, I guess I just, I have a sister myself, and I would just find it disgusting to watch, to think about having sex with her. Mm. So the experimenter follows the script, which is, because people often say something like that. And so the experimenter says, well, okay, you'd find it disgusting, but does that make it wrong? I mean, personally, like if I were to see two men having sex, like I personally would find that disgusting. I wouldn't want to watch it. But, that doesn't make it wrong. I mean, if people are inclined that way, they have every right to do it. There's nothing wrong with it. So, okay, so, I've shown this video 50 times. But by the time class was over, a student had emailed the dean to complain about my homophobia. I thought she must have just missed the part. She must have misunderstood the video. I mean, I said, well, come talk to me tomorrow. Let's look at the video. You'll see he's not condemning homosexuality. He's actually pro-gay rights. But she engineered. Basically, she brought the class to a standstill. She demanded that I apologize, and finally, she bullied me into apologizing. And finally, I did, just because I had to keep the class going. And this was because it was an intensive class every day for a week. So I apologized, but she didn't like the apology, so she brought me in front of the Equal Opportunity Commission. And there was no way that they were going to convict me.
This is at UVA?
No, it's at NYU. But the point is, it took like about a month out of my life. And during that time, she mounted a social media, or she had other people mount a social media campaign, writing things about how homophobic I am. So it was really a nightmare. And I was so like, what the hell is going on? Like, where is it? It just didn't make any sense. I mean, I've been parts of groups pushing for gay rights. My research is on disgust. Actually, I have a paper showing how you can reduce prejudice against gay people. So I felt like, my intentions are all in the right place. I didn't say anything. What's going on? And then other things similar to that happened to me, and then began happening to lots of other people. And this is in the 2013 to 2014 academic years when this all begins to happen. The campus disinvitations, the words trigger warning and safe space, they barely exist before 2012, but by 2014 they're everywhere. And this is why when Greg Lukianoff, who is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, when he came to me in the summer of 2014 with his diagnosis that, John, this weirdness going on campus, it's exactly the errors that I learned about in cognitive therapy. Like campus is teaching undergraduates to think in the exact distorted ways that cognitive therapy teaches you not to do, like catastrophizing, mind reading, all those sorts of things. And so I was so busy. I was saying no to everything. But when Greg came to me after my own experiences, I said, oh my God, Greg, this is brilliant. This is what's going on. So that's what led to he and I writing this article that was published in The Atlantic last August. And it was, and we had no idea campuses were going to melt down beginning at Halloween at Yale, Missouri, so many other schools. So a very strange thing is happening, and I think it's so interesting. I mean, it's horrible because it basically has put a chill on free speech. Everyone is afraid of saying anything that will set off the most sensitive student in the class. Professors all over the country are scrubbing their syllabi clean. We're not showing videos that could provoke. We're not saying things. So education is taking a nosedive in this country because everyone's afraid of a big social media storm or being charged with marginalizing or whatever it is.
So one of the first things I want to say about this story is that Haidt should never have apologized to that student. He talks of being bullied into it by one student, but you can see the obvious problem. Now what you've done is legitimize illegitimate outrage. Now maybe that's easy for me to say. It's not my job that is potentially in danger. But if a student can bring a class to a standstill because they feel offended, then that just emboldens more of that type of infantile behaviour. And you might recall the recent firing of a teacher in British Columbia for having the wrong opinion. Dave Cullen covered this story in his December 13th edition of Regressive News. Apparently the teacher in question was giving examples of how some people's sense of personal ethics was more liberal than the letter of the law. And he gave the example of how people might roll through a stop sign on a deserted road, deeming it morally acceptable, even if unlawful. Then he gave a personal example when he said, "I find abortion to be wrong, but the law is often different from our personal opinions." So a little later, the class had a 5-minute break, and when it resumed, several students didn't return, among them a popular young woman who had gone to an administrator to complain that what the teacher had said triggered her, that she felt unsafe, and that in any case he had no right to an opinion on the subject of abortion because he was a man. A stunning display of snowflakery. Now the upshot of it all was that even though he apologised to the student in the end, it still wasn't good enough and he was fired. So in some cases, even if you do apologise, you can still lose your job. And no doubt, taking a stand is difficult if the administration have no backbone, but I can't believe that they can get away with firing this guy in British Columbia on such flimsy grounds under Canadian law. But then again, maybe I can, given what Jordan Peterson's been subjected to at the University of Toronto. But back to Haidt. I want to play another part of the podcast where he attempts to explain why the politically correct social justice warriors of today are different than in previous eras.
So political correctness is not new. Even back in the 60s, there were all kinds of things you could not say. There was a big wave of it in the early 1990s and hate speech codes, all that sort of stuff. What's new is the idea that students or people, but especially students, are so fragile that if they're exposed to something that is an offensive idea, they will be traumatized, they will be damaged. And that wasn't there in the 90s. In the 90s, the idea was this is an incredible injustice. You're a bad person for saying this. You're a bad person for studying this. But there wasn't the idea that, oh, you've traumatized people, you've damaged people. So that's new, the idea of fragility. And this grows out. I've learned a lot since Lukianoff when I wrote the Atlantic article. This ultimately seems to grow out of the massive changes in child rearing that happened in the United States after the early 1980s. So if you were born before about 1975, then you had a childhood like people all over the world have always had, which is that you spent a lot of time without adult supervision. And sometimes you got in fights, sometimes you got lost, sometimes you got scared, and you'd figure it out yourself. But we had a real crime wave beginning in the 70s, and there were several high-profile abductions, especially Eitan Pate's 3 blocks south of where I'm sitting right now in Greenwich. And right around the time of Eitan Pate's, just after that, we get cable TV. And once we get cable TV, we have constant 24-hour coverage of every child abduction. So even though pretty much nobody abducts children other than the non-custodial parent, Americans came to fear that if they ever had kids unsupervised, those kids would be abducted. It is literally illegal to let your 8-year-old walk to a park 2 blocks away. You can be arrested for doing that. So parents don't do that. Kids are never without adult supervision until they're mid-teens in many cases. And so what happens is students get to college and they have not had a chance to really deal with setbacks and even insults on their own. There's always been some authority that they should appeal to. So they get to college and somebody says something. Maybe somebody criticizes affirmative action, and that hurts. They don't like it. So what do? They have this whole ideology built for them, they might even have encountered it before college, that says that they are a victim of microaggression. Somebody, perhaps a professor, although professors are always on the left, so it might not have been, it's probably more a student. Most of the complaints are actually about students. So some student said something and it hurts. And so you don't say something back, you go straight to the dean or the diversity administrator. You file charges. So this is what's new. This didn't happen 10 or 15 years ago. This is just the last couple of years. They call it accountability. They say we need to hold professors accountable for what they say. But when everybody in the class is holding the professor accountable for not making them feel bad, I mean, it's like being back in, communist Romania or East Germany. You're speaking to the Politburo, and if you say anything out of line, you're in big trouble.
So there you have it. Helicopter parenting, brought on by sensationalized media reporting, has given birth to Generation Snowflake, and on top of it, has even more dire consequences for university campuses. We saw in the previous video that the ratio of left-leaning faculty has ballooned in recent years, stifling diversity of political opinion, and with the intolerance of Generation Snowflake, you're even less likely to hear diversity of opinion in a classroom for fear of reprisal. So perhaps Jordan Peterson is correct. With the exception of the hard sciences, universities are doing more harm than good. And if administration and faculty aren't going to stand up to this nonsense, then it's incumbent on parents to withdraw their funding from universities that promote social justice lunacy and encourage their children to look for alternatives, such as starting their own businesses, trade schools, or practical vocations that will actually equip them with the skills that people value and are willing to pay for.